Welcome to this evening's Christ to the Core Fall Series event. I'm Sarah Miglio, Assistant Provost here at Wheaton College, and it's an honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Christian Smith. Every Wheaton College student reads Dr. Smith's 2005 Princeton lecture on moralistic therapeutic deism for their Core 101 class. And it isn't often that we have the privilege to welcome to campus and hear from directly someone who's a distinguished scholar that we assign for reading for our core class. So this is a special night. Christian Smith is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. He's well known for his research focused on religion, adolescence, and emerging adults, as well as social theory. He received his MA and PhD from Harvard University in 1990 and his BA from Gordon College in 1983, although I will add he transferred to Gordon College from Wheaton College. Dr. Smith was a professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 12 years before his move to Notre Dame in 2006. Dr. Smith is bringing to us tonight a sneak peek and advanced glance at some brand new ideas and thoughts, an emerging track of research that he's now pursuing with some starter money from the Lilly Foundation, looking at dramatic changes and trends in American culture and American churches. His title, Something Shifted, Explaining Change in the American Religious Zeitgeist, highlights what I think many of us have sensed over the past few years: significant cultural and religious changes that at times almost feel like the familiar ground we once knew is shifting beneath our feet a little bit. I don't doubt that we will be challenged and provoked tonight to consider what Dr. Smith's observations and analysis of these cultural trends will mean both for our faith community and for understanding the trajectory of American religious practice and belief here in America. We will have the privilege of hearing Dr. Smith's lecture, followed by a brief time of conversation with our very own Dr. Emily McGowan from the School of Bible and Theology, who's an assistant professor of theology, and Dr. David Cetrin, the Price LaBarre Chair of Christian Formation and Ministry. Will you please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dr. Christian Smith.
Wow, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming out. It's a real honor on a Thursday at a busy time of the semester when it's raining. It's a real honor to have you all come out and hear what I have to say tonight. And so thank you to Wheaton, thank you to Sarah, and thank you to you all. I hope what I have to say is interesting to you, it registers with you, it makes sense, and it's illuminating, and it helps you understand your life and your world better. So before I get started with the PowerPoint, two things, reiterating a little bit of what Sarah said. The first is, I'm a sociologist. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not an activist. What I talk about here, I'm not endorsing it. I'm not approving of it. I'm just describing and trying to analyze as best as I can what's going on, what has been going on in our culture and society. So take it within that frame of reference, please. Second, I'm at the very start of this project. A lot of times people present at the end of their research, here's what I found. I haven't done the research yet. I have a whole bunch of thoughts that I put together. I'm starting to work on things, so actually I'm interested, maybe afterwards we could talk, or you could email me in any of your reactions or things you think I've missed or whatever. I'm really open to discussion to this business, but it has a little bit of there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. Here's what I think it adds up to, kind of feel to it, rather than polished. It's not too polished. So, something shifted. I got this title, it's a little twist on, in Lord of the Rings, after the ring enters Mordor, and two orcs, Shagrat and Gorbag, are like something went wrong. And one of them says, you say something may have slipped, I say something did slip. Now, I'm not saying American religion is Mordor and it's been entered into by this, anything like that, so I had that, but I decided to just leave it. But there's another Lord of the Rings reference in here. So what shifted and what resulted? I'm working with two hypotheses here. The first is that a complex series of profound social changes in more or less the last 3 decades have transformed the larger cultural terrain in which mainstream American religions operate, making it more difficult for religious narratives and organizations to gain traction, especially among young Americans. And this is very much focused on younger Americans. My second hypothesis is, hit the right button and I'll get it. Most tuned-in religious leaders and thinkers intuitively sense these big changes, yet from my discussions have difficulty pinpointing and naming and responding to them in a clear way. So what I want to do is in the next coming years, moving forward from here, is to name these changes to explain causally why and how they transformed the cultural landscape in the United States, and to describe the consequences for American religion. So one last caveat. The older you are, the more perspective you will have on these changes. If you are part of the first semester, first year in college, you've been born into this. It's like it's this water that you swim and breathe in, so to speak. So you have a little bit less perspective, but that's okay. We're going to move forward, and I think a lot of it, I hope, will make sense to you. So first, we could start off with quote-unquote objective measures of organized religious decline. And so what we're talking about here are changes that make it harder to be, to practice, and to minister in religions. So let's start off with this graph here. This is this is Americans, strong or somewhat strong religious affiliation. So on a survey, people asked, how are you religiously affiliated? Are you strongly affiliated? Somewhat, not that very, these are the strong and somewhats. And it's separated by decade of birth. So there's a bunch of different lines here. At the top, on the top left, it says less than 1915. Those are really old people that were born a long time ago. And in the 70s, you can see the years at the bottom, how strongly affiliated they were. So what we see here is every decade that went by that Americans were born, that cohort of Americans were less and less and less and less strongly affiliated with religion. You get that idea? So at the bottom, we have those born between 85 and 94, much, much, much less strongly religiously affiliated. You get that idea? Okay, here's a quiz question for you, kind of quasi-statistics. If we didn't have it separated by age, we just put all the Americans together, what would the line look like? Somebody. You just aggregated it all together, one line. Pretty flat, yeah, it would be pretty flat. And it would be up around 50 whatever percent. Might be a little decline, but overall it would be pretty flat. So in other words, if we just looked at all Americans, we'd say, hey, religious affiliation is pretty stable. But if you disaggregate it by age of birth, year of birth, you see, it's stable for each year cohort, but every year cohort of birth decade that goes down is less and less religious affiliation. You get that? Meaning the younger you are, the less likely you are to be religiously affiliated. And that's fairly stable across the life course. In fact, you can see the older people, the older they got, the more religiously affiliated strongly they became. But then right about Gen Xers, right after the baby boomer, it flattened out. All right. This is the same thing, religious service attendance. You see the exact same pattern. Every decade of birth that goes by, there's lower and lower and lower levels of religious service attendance. And this is people reporting they know God exists. Identical pattern. Every decade later in the 20th century that an American was born, they're less likely as a cohort to know that God exists. This is fairly recently published in the top journal in sociology. We also know, and many of you must be very familiar with this, that there has, since the early 90s, 1991 to be exact, a dramatic growth in the number of Americans who say they are not religious. Until 1991, every year we asked that, it was completely stable at a very low number, about 7%, but the same number, not religious. Something happened, something shifted, and then it starts to go up. Keep 1991 in mind. So this evidence suggests that American religious exceptionalism, meaning Europe has gone secular, but we're especially religious, that is actually faltering. Maybe actually the US will become an American version of Europe religiously. That's what this evidence suggests is where things are headed. But what I find more fascinating and difficult than this objective survey statistics data are the associated subtle, amorphous cultural shifts that go along with this. What is the zeitgeist that goes along or that's behind these statistical findings? So it's a little bit like this.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it.
Okay, so it's easy to ask people how often they attend church. It's much harder to get a grip on this sort of the spirit of the age, like what's going on in the cultural atmosphere with regard to the plausibility of religion, the sensibility of religion. That's what I'm trying to get at here, and it's hard. I am not tonight going to describe the zeitgeist. I'm going to focus on what I think are some of the social forces, economic, technological, political forces that have led to a transformation of the zeitgeist. We may feel it in the air, the water, the earth, but what I'm going to focus on is what's behind it here. So what are the contributing causes? And some of these are causes, and some of them are also causes and effects at the same time. And what I want us to think about is not how does these feel in general, but if somebody was a teenager or in their 20s or in their 30s growing up in this era, what would it feel like, and how would that affect one's interest in, say, Christian faith, the church, and so on? But that's the perspective. So first, some long-term trends. Now I'm going to run through a whole bunch of factors. I'm going to put them out on the table, and we can see what we think of them. The first is we know that for a very long time we've known this. There is a declining trust in the United States in social institutions. Every social institution that exists, over time, since this has been measured, fewer and fewer Americans say they trust them. Right? The least trusted is Congress. The most trusted is the military. So there's variance in them. Here I'm focused on religious, organized religion. And you can see 2 separate surveys conducted over time. It's not super dramatic, but there's a growing decline in trust in religious organizations. This is also the exact same thing, but it's separated out by generation. So you can see the millennials are the youngest. They're in the purple. The greatest generation is my father's generation. So every generation, there's less and less trust, and the curve actually gets steeper over time. The more that the millennials live, the less they trust religious organizations. The second is declining participation in face-to-face organizations. This could be anything, a neighborhood, a club, a bowling league, whatever. But historically, in the United States, Christianity was practiced in church congregations, which means meeting with people face-to-face, getting to know them, being a community, worshiping together, and so on. What we have going on in general, in almost every way, is fewer and fewer Americans are leaving their house, going to meet with other people face-to-face. Of course, the internet has something to do with this, which we'll get to. COVID is a huge thing that is a wild card at this point. But fewer and fewer Americans are interested in getting out and meeting in face-to-face organizations that they're members of. Here's another version of the same thing. You can see all these different kinds of organizations. Only a few have increased since 1974. Another thing that's been going on broadly, again, this doesn't have to do directly with religion, but this is a huge long-term transformation, and it's what sociologists call the de-institutionalization of marriage and family. And what this means is, waiting longer to get married than people used to, waiting longer to have first child than people used to, cohabiting, more percentage of people cohabiting before marriage or indefinitely as a replacement of marriage, maybe never having children, voluntary childlessness, having a nice dog instead of a baby. A lot more people living alone. The number of Americans, especially young Americans who live by themselves, has grown a ton. Greater divorce, and then other more complicated kind of relationships. All this sociologists view as, you once had this pretty firm institution called marriage and family. It's become deinstitutionalized. There's a lot less investment in, a lot less practicing in, a lot more delaying of it. This has consequences for American religion because American religion fate is very closely tied to the quote-unquote traditional family, heterosexual couples having children and feeling, oh, shouldn't we take them to Sunday school? There's a very strong tie there. So if there are changes in family formation, there will be consequences for religion. Another, which I don't really have time to unpack here, but is the emergence of emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is a phase of life that many of you have just launched into, which roughly between the age of 18 and 29, which is the transition from being a teenager at home and being a full adult. So what emerging adulthood involves, the idea behind this is, in former days, it used to be a much shorter and well-defined transition. Marry your high school sweetheart, start having kids, get a job at the factory or at the office, start paying off your 30-year mortgage, and that it didn't take too long to go from being high school to a real adult. Because of a lot of other changes, this period of time has been stretched for most way, way, way out, maybe 10 years, where you're not really a teenager, but you're not really a full adult, according to the way Americans think about full adulthood. And what's important about this emerging adulthood is the idea that for most emerging adults, it's not just stretched out, but there's a lot of murkiness, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of freedom, there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of opportunities, but there's also a lot of ambiguity and anxiety and unclarity about relationships and trying this, no, hit the reset button, try that, etc. A lot of you, believe me, in the next 10 years, that's what your life is going to be like. I'm sorry to tell you, but that's what's going on. There's a transformation in the introduction between being a girl and being a real adult woman. It's stretched out, and your life is going to be a lot uncertain. Again, that has consequences for American religion and culture broadly. So there's all this is just sort of a pictorial representation of it's complicated, it's messy, it's difficult, there's a lot going on, there's a lot to figure out, et cetera, in one's 20s especially. Another development in our culture and society, if people decide to have children, or when they decide to have children, it's this essentially, it's actually referred to as a movement called the intensive parenting movement, which is, it's no longer okay, especially if you're middle class or upper middle class, it's no longer okay to just sort of make sure your kid doesn't get run over by a truck, make sure they get enough calories, and get them through school. That's not okay anymore. Now, parents, both mom and dad ideally, have got to intensively sort of schedule them up, get them in classes, figure out what all their gifts are, make sure that they have lessons so that all their gifts can be developed, watch over them as they do homework, get them in lots of sports very early on so that children's lives are jam-packed and basically managed by parents. It hasn't always been that way. Some of you have, that's been your life, but it hasn't always been that way, believe me. So this also has consequences if you think sociologically about who has time for what are the priorities, what will count as success in life for parents, what are they going to invest in for their children. Okay, now let's totally shift gears, geopolitical events with reverberations for religion. This is at a whole nother level now. Events, the end of the Cold War, which I know for a lot of you feels like the Dark Ages, but it wasn't that long ago. Why would the end of the Cold War have anything to do with American religion? Well, here's my story. I'm not sure about it, but I think there's something to it. By the way, notice when the end of the Cold War was. Maybe a coincidence? Okay. During the Cold War, America had a certain identity in the world. The entire world's geostrategic political situation was governed by the conflict between the US and mostly Russia. And from the US point of view, Russia was the enemy, and that enemy was atheist, communist, godless, right? So remember, if you don't believe in God, you're not a real American. Part of the identity of being an American was to be, we are theists, we are Judeo-Christian. And so whether or not any individual was a Baptist or whatever didn't matter. This was the structure of culture in terms of understanding the world, all right? So what happens, so there's all kinds of, I won't say propaganda because it was true. There's all kinds of, growing up in America, you knew the enemy was godless. The enemy was atheist. Well, so in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Luckily, Russia had a sensible leader who decided he was willing to give up on the empire. And so in 1991 comes the end of the Cold War. And what that does is it gives us, in the United States, it takes away from us, it removes the idea that the enemy is godless, okay? That sort of structural configuration is gone. And so then now, conceptually, the question is, are we really one nation under God? And then a bunch of other things that I'm about to get to happen with this. But after the Cold War is over, the United States doesn't lack a new enemy or a new rival, a new adversary. What becomes the new adversary? It starts building in the 90s. Yeah, terrorism. But what kind of terrorists? Muslim, religious terrorists, right? So in the 90s, it starts to build up. There's the bombing in different places around the world. The Clinton administration is pretty oblivious to it, doesn't really do enough. But eventually, not too long a time, we have a new war to fight, a new enemy. And so we go relatively quickly from the enemy is atheist, godless, to the enemy is a religious actor. Now, President George W. Bush was quite good about saying, we're not against Muslims. Muslims are fine. Don't go beat them up in the streets. He was really good about that. But still, it didn't matter because now religion got associated with violence. That was the new association. Religion wasn't we're the Judeo-Christian Americans who are fighting godlessness. Now religion are people running around acting crazy, blowing things up. So all of these different cultural associations now get attached to religion, fanaticism, extremism. It's all over the press, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the point of this is not that people just said, oh, religion is bad, some people did, but that the cultural associations with religion shift as a result of geostrategic political events. Right after, very soon after 9/11, and mostly as a result of it, there was a barrage of atheist writers called the New Atheists, more than these four guys, but basically saying religion is bad. It's not just bad, it's destructive, it needs to be done away with. The old atheists said, hey, I'm an atheist, don't make me pray in school. The new atheists were, we should extinguish religion from all of society. Right? So not everyone bought this, but some people bought this. It introduced a new discourse into the culture, which is religion is not the thing that's going to help us win the war for freedom. Religion is evil. Religion has to do with violence, is what these guys were saying, and others. They convinced some people. There was a backlash against it. People of your generation are like, why are they so aggressive? Why are they so judgy? Why can't everyone just live whatever they want to live? But that came after. First, they had a cultural impact. Okay, now this may be a little harder for some of you, but there were macroeconomic and associated cultural transformations that happened during the same period of time. It's called neoliberalism. I can't go into what neoliberalism is, but believe me, it was a movement that started at the end of World War II by intellectuals. By the end of the 70s, people were ready to change the economy. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher instituted a revolution that set neoliberalism into place. And in the 90s, Bill Clinton and his buddy over there in England. So it all had to do with globalization too. They all sort of set this loose on the world. So what the consequences for young people, especially, that I want to draw attention to here, is neoliberalism put the burden on young people, individual competition. You are all set against each other to compete. Your job is to build your human capital to beat out other people for the better jobs, for the better paying jobs. Human capital building, deregulation. Just let the market do its thing. Profiteering, the marketizing and monetizing of almost all of life. More and more got to be about money, about building your career, and so on. So these images are meant to suggest what's involved when one gets into this kind of rat race version of the economy is careerism becomes an obsession. One is constantly feels like they're competing against their neighbors, have to work all night long in order to get what they want out of life. If you're interested in this, a great book, Kids These Days by Malcolm Harris. If you're interested in this, I recommend this book. So, one thing that comes, the timing on this is not perfect, but here's a survey of college freshmen done since 1970. Every year since 1970, this institute has done this huge survey of college freshmen, and forget the black, yellow, and red lines. Look at the blue and the green lines. We're talking about, the blue is, it's important to college freshmen to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Look what happens to that. The green is being very well off financially is what is important to me. So sort of the values of young people sort of go dramatically different. Now you might notice most of this happened in the 70s. It was continued in the 80s, so that's a different topic. But the point is, there are value changes that have to do with money, income, and visions of what a good life is that are going on during this period of time. Neoliberalism, too, a second effect is that it canceled the previous social contract between corporations and workers. That previous social contract tended to foster settledness. In an old industrial union-ish era, you could get a job and work your whole life for General Motors or whatever life insurance company. It happened. People retired after entire. Neoliberalism changed all that. That social contract, people would be loyal and then people would be rewarded. That was wiped out by neoliberalism and globalization. And so the new facts, especially for young people, are offshoring of work, transience, mobility, competition, upgrading, and precarity. That's the world that you're all moving into. There aren't corporations that are making a social contract to take care of you as long as you're loyal to them. It doesn't work that way anymore. And so what kind of lifestyle, and not just lifestyle, but mentality, does that shape young people into? Like, I better not put down roots. I better keep all my options open. I need to be ready to move. I have to be ready to upgrade my skills. I'm precarious. I better stay on top of things. I need to beat the competition, et cetera. Back to that theme. So job hopping, this sense of like, I could lose my job anytime. Am I going to be working at Burger King? I can't pay off my student debts. All of this comes out of neoliberalism. Again, what I'm trying to say sociologically here is macroeconomic social changes related to globalization have consequences for real people's lives, especially young people, that then has consequences for their ability to say, I think I'll join a church and get involved and teach Sunday school and get to know people. How can you do that when you have to move to Seattle next week? Or et cetera, et cetera. That's the basic idea. Okay, along with all of this comes a lot of material prosperity. So there's this hypermass consumerism where the good life is defined as the goods life. You get that idea? So what it means to be an existing person is to be able to shop and buy things, first in a store, then online. In the 1980s, there was this huge upscaling effect where you no longer sort of watched Mayberry RFD, but instead you watch shows about how rich and famous people lived, and shouldn't we all be like that? So everyone's eyes were raised up, I want to become more rich, I want to have more things, etc. That's all just continued to grow. Actually, what was happening during this period of time since the 80s, almost all the benefits of the economic growth have gone to the top 10%, actually 1%. So, and those are people that are not in their 20s. These are boomers. So there's a generational conflict also going on here. So for a lot of people, they're working harder and harder and not benefiting from it. So among young, there's this growing frustration, and so on. This all works partly through advertising, and the advertising goes lower and lower and lower in age of who they're targeting. Anyone who has any discretionary income is targeted for a certain vision. It's not just like, why don't you buy our product? It's, here's a narrative of life. Here's an identity you should buy into. Here's what the good life looks like. That's hitting kids that are 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and shaping a certain kind of consciousness. And you say, what does any of that have to do with Jesus? Is the question. Then, along with consumerist material things, are consumerist sexual norms. And the first sexual revolution was in the 1920s, your great-grandparents, but we're not going to think about that. And, but the second sexual revolution was in the late 60s and 70s, but then since then it's just sort of expanded out, and what's considered okay or normal or people talk about or it happens or you know people or whatever has just gone from sort of, oh, I wonder if I should date that person, are we going to get married, to all kinds of this stuff. I don't need to elaborate it. I think you're familiar with it. Hopefully not too personally, but you know, it's just a different world in terms of sexual norms. Compare that to what the church teaches. It's a complete, total mismatch. You get it? This is where, I'm not saying the church should change its ethics in order to get more market share. I'm saying it's just simply there's a huge mismatch between what people take, young people especially, take to be normal, obvious, like people, and what churches are saying about these things. Just totally opposite directions. Another dimension of all this is that issues of same-sex and queer and so on, huge generational sea change. When I first interviewing teenagers in the early 2000s, almost everyone was like, what's the big deal? Like, well, how could we be mean to these people? It was just, from this age to that age, totally a very different outlook on the assumptions of why this was even an issue. And again, there are churches and denominations who are fine and affirming and welcoming of all this, but for the most part, most young people they wouldn't know that, and they certainly wouldn't associate, oh, religion is fine with what I take to be fine, right? There'd be a sense that they don't approve. That wouldn't be accepted. Add to all this pop postmodernism, which conveys, again, I don't have time to explain all this, but conveys a sense of skepticism of everything, authorities, authors, meta-narratives, anything that tries to make a claim to a big truth, that's a power move, that's a power grab. You better be suspicious of that. Deconstructing everything, fluidity, the very sense of a self as having any coherence or integrity. Well, pop postmodernism kind of liquidates. We can reconstruct ourselves and everything's changing all the time. That's fine. And it shows up all kinds of weird ways in culture. This has a profound effect. It's not that the official theorists like Derrida or Foucault or whoever are read by 22-year-olds. It's just that it filters out to culture, and that's why I call it pop, and starts to affect the assumptions and outlooks of the mainstream, basically. All right, I'm burning through a whole bunch of stuff here, but we're going to keep going. The question of national identity and personal identity fits into all this, I have a suspicion, and how those are transformed. So for a good long time, there was this notion, there was something called a Judeo-Christian religion, and that's what America would be based on. That's why we need 10 commandments in courthouses and so on like that. So the idea of Judeo-Christian, or just Christian heritage, Christian founders, all this, was a plausible story about what would hold us together, what we shared, what our heritage was. But what happened is, somewhere around the turn of the century, a whole bunch of, because of immigration, changes in immigration law, and lots of other reasons, a lot of reports came out saying, we're no longer a Christian nation. Protestants are not in the majority, and we need to learn to live with religious pluralism. It was actually demographically true, but I think what the consequence it had, or I'm arguing or suspecting, is this notion of Well, being Christian is not the basis of being American. Like, this is not what's going to glue us together anymore, because there's too much difference. So we have to be multicultural, we have to be accepting of lots of religious diversity. And so the capacity of religion to be like a glue for our society kind of went away. Something else had to come along to fulfill that. I won't run through all of this, but the bottom line is, it's a minority of Americans who think that religion matters for defining what it means to be an American. Remember back to the slide on the Cold War? If you don't believe in God, you're not an American. Well, now most think you don't need to be Christian or religious or anything in order to be a good American, except for white evangelical Protestants. They're the last holdout. But even if you look there, a sizable minority of white evangelical Protestants do not say that. 33%. A third don't think being religious matters for sort of national identity. Okay, this is a huge one. The establishment of spiritual as an identity category. It wasn't too long ago when there was not this category, spiritual, or spiritual but not religious. That's for those of you who are younger, that's a relatively newish category that's been popularized. And of course, it's all over the place now, and it's promoted in middle schools in various forms, and it's supposed to bring you health, and et cetera, and all this. But here's what matters to me sociologically as I think about it. Before this category, you were religious or you were not religious. And not religious had a kind of a tone of like, kind of a hardcore, materialist, secular, atheist type. That's probably not that good. In the middle of that opens up this category, spiritual, or spiritual but not religious. So you don't have to be religious anymore, but that doesn't turn you into a kind of a jackass, hardcore atheist, like you're a problem person. You can still be cool and subjective and like understand what's going on inside of you and like relate to nature and all the good things that are different from a hardcore materialist, you can still have. But you don't need religion, meaning institution, organization, tradition, narrative, heritage. You can totally be in charge as an individual to make it up as you want, to define it as you want. It can be New Age, it can be blah, 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 anything. And that created the space in a sort of identity territory for a whole bunch of people who previously said, I guess I'm religious, I'm not religious, to spill over into this and exit out of the organized institutional religious domain. You get that idea? So it's simply giving people an identity space that they didn't have before, moves people out of organized religion. And that has other consequences. And it's not just how many people are sitting in pews, it's also what is the sensibility, again, the cultural zeitgeist of what it means to go to church or to be a spiritual person, etc. Not all of it, but a lot of spirituality talk is explicitly anti-religious. It's explicitly, to be spiritual is you're not part of, you don't believe God is a personal being. You don't believe God is outside of yourself, or that God isn't in pantheism or something like. There are lots of versions of this, but it's not just a benign, there's lots of ways to be spiritual. There's a stream of it that's very powerfully, if you're spiritual, you are not a Christian that goes to church, or Jewish that goes to temple or synagogue. This has affected everybody. This is only a 5-year snapshot on the left, but in 5 years, in sociological terms, tremendous growth in the number of Americans, both parties, both genders, all this, who are switching over to I'm spiritual. And that is taken out of the hide of the one at the top, religious and spiritual. That the growth in spiritual but not religious comes from religious and spiritual. Okay. This is one I have no idea what to do with. I have no hypothesis. I just know that it's important. What is the sacred scripture of this generation? And a lot of you you weren't part of the mania, but there was a mania. And it was powerful, and it was sustained over a long period of time. I don't know what to make of it. All I'm doing is putting it out there. Harry Potter matters. That's it. I have this is another suspicion, I don't totally know about this, but religion has declined as a significant public marker of identity. Not just what it means to be an American, or will being religious or Judeo-Christian glue us together as a people, but which identity categories are those that you want to identify with, that matter, that when people talk about what are the identities that matter, they matter. That's the question here. So in the past, religion used to matter. In the early 20th century, especially in small towns, if you were a Baptist, you were not a Methodist, and certainly not a Presbyterian. And those differences really mattered. Denominations mattered. Your family's connection to which mattered. That sort of changed over time into Protestant, Catholic, Jew. So Protestants kind of got all morphed together. But in the middle 20th century, and it was thought, we're a nation of three religions. Protestants are dominant, but there's Catholics and Jews too, and we have tensions between them, but we should all get along. So, as late as the late 50s, the idea that we shouldn't elect John F. Kennedy to be president because he was Catholic and he would listen to the Pope more than the American people was a really, really live issue, and he barely beat Richard Nixon to the presidency. And we would have to have campaigns during the war, sort of like, look, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews can actually be in the same army, and we're all together fighting for freedom. Can you imagine this billboard now? People are like, what? Who are they again? So Kennedy winning the presidency was a turning point for Catholics, but ever since then, and especially recently, the question is, which identities matter? What are people worried about or talking about or conflicted over or really invested in? Or they're sticking up for their rights for? It's changed. It's now about gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. For some social class, but that doesn't get much traction in the US. Right? That's what people are invested in. So whether you're Baptist or Methodist, who cares? Or Catholic. There's a recent article in The Atlantic that says not only has religion gone into politics, politics has become like religion, like religious. So our increasing polarization, Republicans, Democrats, blah, 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 all this is increasingly, some people argue, is increasingly becoming like quasi-religions that people are devoted to and are willing to go to the mat over. So that, again, this is a little vague, I don't know about that, but I just throw that out there. All right, here's one that everyone's familiar with, and I only have a few thoughts about this, but the digital revolution. This is simply a change in technologies of relating and communicating. Absolutely huge. The consequences of this are indescribable, immeasurable. The first is the time-sucking attention entertainment aspect of all this. So there's just so much, and a lot of us are sort of over that, or like, okay, I wasted too much of my life on, but still, the one question is, what do people do with their time, and what do they not have time for? Do they have time for devotions, reading the Bible, going to prayer meeting, blah, 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 or not? This has made a big impact on people's time use. Second, alternative community without commitment or face-to-face. So now people have communities in virtual worlds where they can be sitting all around people that they never talk to, and they're instead networked digitally. Again, none of this is new observation, but I want to throw this out there and connect it to what is this, how does this contribute to a zeitgeist where young people maybe, who cares about church? The third is immediate information on everything, but including on all religions, spiritualities, and philosophies in the privacy of your own home. You don't have to go visit the Eastern Orthodox Church to see what that's about. You just sit in your chair and Google them, or Wicca, or anything you want. You don't have to go meet people. You don't have to go check things out in the real world. It's all right immediately there at your fingertips. This has consequences for how people make sense of and et cetera, religious possibilities. Lastly, the internet creates a radical individualization of authority. Before the internet, who had authority? newspaper editors, book editors, like people who were experts allegedly, and they decided this will get printed, this will go online, da 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 da. Now it's any number of literally billions of possibilities. Google can sort of sort out based on what other people have wanted to look at, but basically in the end it's like, I got more information I know what to possibly do with, so each person decides for themselves what to believe and what to do with that. And eventually, according to one understanding at least, is it leads to a post-truth society because people are not living in the same world. Literally, we're getting different messages based on algorithms that people figure out what they think we want to hear, and that's what we get. And then people are living in completely different worlds, and it's going to ruin democracy. But right now, I'm not focused on democracy. I'm focusing on religion. So the idea that there's a truth, well, who decides that? Okay, last two major categories. The first is sociopolitically induced anxiety, nihilism, and despair. I detect a diffuse despair, cynicism, nihilism, resignation over a lot of things among young people, not among baby boomers. They're going to die before it hits them. But if you're 20, you're not going to die before it all hits you. And so there's a lot of negative emotion around environmental catastrophes, global warming, rigged politics, corporate power, boomer wealth hoarding, digital surveillance, and other dystopian futures. So the idea that progress, growth, and social betterment, especially after the 2008, 2009 financial meltdown, real estate crisis, and so on, there's a sense that we're all getting screwed here, like people on Wall Street are walking away with billions who did this to us, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what remains of this that I've picked up in my research is individual teens that I talked to, all of them said, yeah, the world's going to hell. I hope to do okay. I will somehow rise above the horrors that are coming. I hope to have a good career and family. So it's individual survival amidst sort of letting all the rest of it go to pieces. So what does this have to do with the religious zeitgeist? I don't know. I just don't know how all this nihilism and despair fits with up from the grave he arose. I just don't know how it fits. Like it's just another weird mismatch to me. So just a couple of visual images. I mean, I know a bunch of undergrads. This is the world they live in. Or this. And while some of them may protest, underneath this protest is not a hope that they're going to change things. It's a depressed fury that old people have destroyed the world and made a bunch of money, and now we're going to leave it to young people who it's going to be too late and too little. And now there's a bunch of new literature and programs on sort of how to not want to kill yourself over climate change, basically, sort of how to deal with the emotions of this. Then for you freshmen are too young for this, but there was a whole generation that lived through 20 years of war that was seemingly never ending, longer than Vietnam, and it had dimensions to it, like this stuff that were really bad. It's not like every military person serving was bad, but there were things that just were bad for America. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal and so on. And then when we went to Iraq, it turned out, oops, the reason we fought this war was made up. It was like it was something between a lie and we got information from someone we tortured and he told us what we wanted to hear. Like that's why we invaded Iraq. It's not why we invaded, but that was the public, what was behind why we said we were invading. And then last month, after spending trillions of dollars, we pull out of Afghanistan and the Taliban are, so Osama bin Laden's dead. The Taliban are back in power. Like, what did 20 years accomplish? All this money, where did it go, et cetera. I'm not taking a political stand. What I'm saying is, from young people's perspective who grew up their whole life, some of my children, their whole life was grown up under this war and seeing this news, it has an effect. It shapes consciousness. It forms the zeitgeist in ways that I think are not irrelevant for religion. Okay, more recently, again, this is not me criticizing Trumpists or whatever. I'll be neutral on that. But young people, especially moderate to progressive young people, which most are, They see this on the news and they think, what? Our whole democracy could just fall apart pretty soon. Like the idea of peaceful transfer of power just about didn't happen. And then when they see this, oh, there's a whole bunch of Christians are involved in this. There is a minority who will think, oh, good. But the vast majority of young people will say, if that's what religion's about, forget it. This is BS. Okay, lastly, American religion itself, anatomy of self-sabotage. Now, I study religion. A lot of great stuff happens in religion. I'm not anti-religious. I understand so much great stuff happens in religion. But religious institutions and actors have done a lot to kill its own credibility. This starts with whatever you think of the Christian right, there were a lot of Americans who thought religion was good, church was good, Christianity's fine, until the Christian right got involved in politics and they said, this is not American, this is not me, I don't believe in this. If this is religion, I'm not going to be religious anymore. So in an effort to save Christian America, a whole lot of Americans were pushed out of Christianity. There are really great articles that analyze this scientifically. It's not just opinion, it's just pretty well established fact. So there's an anti-religious reaction to the Christian right. Maybe you've heard of Westboro Baptist. Now, the reason I put this out there, this is an extreme case. This is not evangelicalism, but here's a true story. Last week, I listened to an interview by one of my researchers who interviewed a Catholic who's now alienated from the Catholic Church. And one of our questions is, do you know anything about evangelicalism? She's like, nah, maybe I've heard, I don't really know. Well, the only thing she could think of, what she knew about evangelicalism was this church. Right, so this church is representing you, if you're an evangelical, to a lot of Americans, meaning evangelicalism, for lots of reasons, has a huge public relations problem with a lot of non-evangelicals. They just don't know, they don't understand, and the people that are the most wacky are the ones who get the microphone and stand up on your behalf. So we could argue about lots of things here, but the point is, think about the Zeitgeist, what this does to most young people looking out at the world and saying, do I want to be religious? Should I consider the Christian God? Are you kidding? Certainly not evangelicalism. Same thing here. There are young people who are pro-Trump, but when they see sort of so many religious actors gathering around and blessing the Trumpist policy, it's a complete, and it's an emotionally violent reaction. No, it's not going to happen. All right. All right, we got too many of these going on. How did that slide get in there? All right, another one, scandals. Some of this goes back to the 80s, and at the time it was buffoonery. It was sort of like, thank God those people are discredited now. But then it's going on like Ted Haggard. He was a good guy. He was the head of the National Association of Evangelicals, and like, he's dealing meth and meeting male prostitution. And it's not just them, it's like on and on. It's been going on for year after year. There's another scandal, there's another problem, there's bazillions of Catholic priests, pedophiles, there's Ravi Zacharias, there's Jerry Falwell Jr., etc. The Southern Baptist Convention, there's huge hoopla there about all kinds of abuse, cover-ups, etc. That does nothing but discredit to anyone who's not completely already committed and going to defend. It just completely morally discredits religion. Even as good a guy as John Howard Yoder, Mennonite, which you would never have suspected. You don't know who he is, but trust me, you never would have suspected. And this was just 2 days ago in the news, 200,000 children. It's not just the United States, it's everywhere, it's all over. Religious scandals that are really horrific stories. Okay, last couple things. I'm really going over my time, but I'm almost done. You know, if you've read the MTD piece, that one thing that's happened in American culture, how and why I don't know, religion has become associated with being a good person, with being moral. The thing that religion does is it helps children learn their morals. Go to Sunday school, Good Samaritan, whatever. Churches are, by most Americans, are viewed essentially as elementary schools of morality. Once you learn it, then you can graduate. It's not that complicated, morality. So, you know, whoever wrote that Sunday school curriculum, Christianity is about God's rules, they should be drowned. Anyway, it's so far gone. But, you know, this is really what a lot of Americans think religion is. So, all it takes is one more question, and it all goes down the toilet. Most people think the thing that religion specializes in, it does not have a monopoly on. It no longer owns the patent on morality. Anybody can know what morality is. It's not that hard. So then why do we need religion? I don't have to be against it. It may be nice. Some people may need it, but it certainly isn't required for anything. If the presupposition started off, religion is about making people nice and good and behave themselves. This is all backed up with, I won't spend time, but there's all kinds of data showing this, and especially young people really believe that you don't need God to be a moral person. We're going to just keep moving on here. Two last things about evangelicalism. I'll end on the evangelical line. Conservative Protestantism is stuck, for better or worse, with a failed modern foundationalist epistemology. I say this in the Billy Graham Center, that emphasize evidence, proof, reason, universality, and indubitable authority. This has been the wagon that evangelicalism has hitched itself to since at least the 19th century. So foundationalism is a modern project. Descartes is a founder, so to speak, of this. And there are different versions of foundationalism, but on the conservative side, we have propositional truth that gives rise to dogma that you know must be true because it's in the Bible, so there's this whole worked out foundationalism. We have an indubitable truth. If you start with this foundation, everything you build up on it will follow necessarily, and everyone will have to agree to it. Well, it turns out that foundationalism was destroyed, these are examples of how it shows up in evangelicalism. Like, it is evidence. It demands a verdict. If you're honest with the evidence, you have to believe Jesus rose from the dead and Christianity is true. Or the Bible is inerrant, and if you believe that, then all these things follow, et cetera, et cetera. Or apologetics. We can argue people into, like we can defend, we can rationally show. The problem is, whether or not that's true, I'm not making a claim. The problem is the culture has moved beyond foundationalism. Philosophers showed a long time ago, it doesn't work, it's impossible. Foundationalism is a failed project. And then culturally, it sort of spilled out both in anti-foundationalism and in postmodernism, this idea, don't give me a reason and all this. It's just, that doesn't work for young people. Reason you into faith or show you evidence that'll convince you. The world, for very many, it's all just a mixed up jumble. And so what will convince somebody is something totally different than what evangelicalism has historically been invested in saying will convince them. There was in the 90s a movement called the Emergent Church Movement, which was an attempt to recreate the evangelical church on postmodernist terms. It really didn't make much sense and it really didn't go anywhere. I mean, it really was a pretty big flop, even though it was a controversy. And so now we have a whole, so in other words, the epistemological foundation of evangelicalism doesn't match with where almost anybody in popular culture is. What's going to persuade them, what's meaningful, it's just ships passing in the night. And I don't think evangelicalism knows how to get past foundationalism. That's a big problem. The last thing is mission drift. After World War II, the neo-evangelical movement was restarted out of fundamentalism that people like Billy Graham and Fuller and Ockenga and Carl Henry said, we have the gospel, it's true, we should engage the culture, we should be intellectually responsible, we should be having answers for the world, we should be involved in things, we shouldn't be separatist, we shouldn't be sectarian, we need to be intellectually engaged and involved. So it was evangelism and engagement with the world. That worked for a while, and then in the 1970s, along comes this guy named Francis Schaeffer, who had an influence on me, I admit, and he sort of was a pivotal figure in changing. At the time, it wasn't clear, but changed from being, we should be evangelizing people and we should be showing them the goodness of Christianity. Schaeffer said, Western civilization's about to go down the tubes because of secular humanism, and Christians need to stand up and fight that. It was a turn toward a political, cultural salvation. And then that eventually worked through the Christian right to the point where now we have such a strong identification of evangelicalism with a certain version of the Republican Party, at least in the public imagination. This is what we call mission drift. We started off with this mission. Somehow, how did we get over here? And the point is, you may love Trump, or it doesn't matter what I'm saying, and my opinion isn't what I'm talking about here. I'm saying from the point of view of teenagers, 20-year-olds, and 30-year-olds, all over the country, when they look at the far right, it's just almost none of them, 90%, it's worse than no appeal. It's just, forget it. So, what does all this add up to? What does it mean? There's a cultural zeitgeist with all kinds of features that do not bode well for the church, for traction of the Christian narrative, for Christian ministry, or for literally just trying to practice Christianity oneself. It's swimming against the tide of an amorphous thing that's been brought together by all kinds of weird, unintended, mostly, forces. So here's the double meaning. I'm done. Are we done? Thank you for allowing me to speak so long.
All right. Well, I wanted to, first of all, just thank Dr. Smith again for this incredible big picture overview of so many changes that are taking place within our culture, and thinking a lot about the future and what the future holds. And I wanted to just kind of start off with, you had mentioned the idea of spiritual but not religious. You had talked a little bit about the declining kind of confidence and faith in institutions. And I wonder, and in fact, I think you said, does the church even matter, sort of in a context like this? And I wonder, just if you can be thinking forward, a lot of times we hear, well, yeah, young people leave the church. That's been happening for a long time. And they come back. You know, they come back when they get married. They come back when they have children. So maybe you could address just, is that still true, do you think? In other words, is this just a kind of temporary generational thing, or is there something more historical happening here? And why does it matter? Because I think, you know, you can talk to a lot of people who might say, well, if people can listen to a great podcast and some Hillsong, why are we so concerned about this lack of institutional engagement, the face-to-face interaction that you talked about too? Kind of where do you see that kind of going, I guess, in the coming generation?
Right. Good questions. The first is, the best predictor of what's going to happen in the future is usually what happened in the past, but it's not always. And the conditions that made it, young people at age 16, 17, 18 leave church, but they'll come back, have changed. The whole thing about the de-institutionalization of marriage and family. A lot of the reason people came back is they were married, and then literally their wife was like, we should go to church, and we have a baby, and shouldn't they go to, I liked my Sunday school. So but if you're not getting married, in fact, if you're divorced, there's all sorts of reasons why people don't want to go to church because they feel out of place. Churches notoriously cater to a certain family demographic, and if you don't fit that, very many of those people feel they don't belong, or worse. So there are changing demographic and institutional conditions that mean you cannot just expect that they'll keep coming back. The analysis we've done shows Catholics are not coming back. Catholic youth are not coming back. Protestant youth are to some degree, but that's mostly evangelicalism, not mainliners. Mainline Protestant, you'd be better to be born an atheist with atheist parents if you want to be religious at age 30 than to be born a mainline Protestant. So if you group Protestants together, it's evangelicals, you all, like good guys and girls or women who are sort of making that statistical effect go. But again, if you disaggregate it, it's very highly localized, A, and B, the underlying conditions are not continuing into the future. Your same question, does it matter that people are meeting face-to-face in congregations? I'm going to sidestep because it's a theological. I mean, there's a difference between listening to a podcast and meeting people face-to-face, or hearing the word preached, or singing with people. They're not the same. Whether Christianity needs to adapt to something else, that's another question I do, but I'm not going to say anything here.
So we're sitting at Wheaton College, very committed to Christian liberal arts. In our first year seminar, we think a lot. We're not quite there yet in the semester, but we're thinking a lot about what Christian liberal arts has to contribute to us as individuals and to us as communities. So just thinking about this picture that you're seeing, this big picture, you teach at a Christian institution. What kind of role is historically Christian institution?
No, it is.
What kind of role is there to play for Christian education in the midst of this environment? Maybe do you see any hopefulness? And then also, are there particular challenges that you think we're well suited to meet in this current moment?
Yeah, Christian liberal arts education is the one and last only hope. No, that's a little overstated.
Not what I was going for.
I mean, there aren't many institutions left where you have these conversations, where you have the time to step back and read and think and talk and grow and develop and disagree. And there aren't many institutions in society left where people who think differently can manage to carry on life together without killing each other. And if colleges and universities can't do that, and if Christian colleges and universities can't do that, it's all over. So I just think that, and liberal arts, I mean, what the system wants out of us is to stop being critical thinkers. It wants people to obey what they're told and to keep running in the hamster cage. So liberal arts gives people different horizons, different worldviews, learn how to think critically, learn how to ask difficult questions, learn how to see things from multiple perspectives. Keeping that alive is about the only thing to keep us from going, now I'm going to really be strong here, in just a totalized world of conformity.
Well, I know that many who are here are first-year students and are in a first-year seminar, have read your piece on moralistic therapeutic deism, and I guess I'm curious, with some of these large-scale changes that you're seeing, do you have a sense that is continuing to be the default kind of American religion? Do you see any of the changes that you've just discussed here changing any of that or leading to any kind of different? I guess I'm thinking, too, of this vision of God as a divine butler and cosmic therapist. Does that seem to fit with some of these large-scale Zeitgeist changes that you're talking about, or do you think it might be morphing into something different?
Yeah, I don't know, because I haven't been out talking with bazillion teenagers recently, but we should expect to think that if the story that I told about that is true, if it's changing or morphing, that's a long-term gradual change. Those things don't change very quickly. So, and I just did a big project on religious parents, and so many religious parents are also moralistic therapeutic deists. That's where it comes from. It's pervasive. It's not just teenagers. So, that said, I still think it's pretty much sort of the baseline out there. That said, some of the changes I talked about, spirituality, move in the direction of the idea, well, do you need a personal God to pray to, who will come? Maybe we can just sort of be more mindful. Or maybe karma, or maybe what was the thing who was it at dinner that talked about the imagining myself into getting the job I want? What's the word for that? Begins with an M. Yeah. So there are all sorts of other less than a personal God who will do something for you versions that most of what I talked about here would push in the direction toward. So my guess is the more children grow up in Methodist, Jewish, whatever congregations, the more they will start off with a personal God. But then as they grow older and as the whole culture moves along, it'll diffuse out into more individualized ideas.
So again, thinking about how many of us are early in our college career in the room tonight, this is a lot to take in, this broad story you've told. And so as they're thinking about being Christian college students, so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how this hits the ground for, a young adult Christian at a Christian liberal arts school. Are there any takeaways that you can think of practically? You teach undergrads yourself, so I wonder how you see this playing out in the lives of just individual young people.
I think there's a really I think there's a really fundamental existential decision that young people face, which is, am I going to live an ordinary life that conforms to the mainstream assumptions and paradigm and try to, as an individual, rise above the chaos that's out there? Or am I going to live a different life that's not ordinary, that might be costly, but that, I hate the phrase could make a difference because it's used by everybody, but that will actually be potentially significant. I really think that's the starting point, at least. And then different ones of you, if you decide I'm not just going to go along with whatever the tide is, you will have very different individual gifts, visions, directions, futures, callings. It could look so many different ways. But underneath of it is this question, am I just going to float through with the current, or am I going to be different? And the way everything is heading, it's harder. Yeah, the only way to make a difference is to be different. So I think the stakes are higher for you all. The price could be higher for you all in your futures. But in some sense, the world is a lot more interesting. And what you do could make more of a difference than poor kid growing up in the 60s.
Yeah, I guess maybe that leads to another question, which is a lot of these things that you're talking about, which are these macro sort of cultural kinds of issues, we can talk about the church responding to these things, but I guess, are there specific ways you're seeing the church sort of being influenced by these things? In other words, that the church itself...
What do you mean, these things?
Well, I'm talking about these large-scale, kinds of issues that you mentioned, so that it's not just about, well, how does the church react or how does the church respond, but is the church itself becoming sort of captive to some of these cultural issues as well, which makes it harder, again, than to live this life of discipleship or costly discipleship in the kind of way we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely captive. You've surely been swimming in the ocean, and a wave comes, and you think, I'll just hop above this one, and the next thing you're eating sand and about to drown with. That's what's happened to the church. It's not just like been influenced. Things are a train wreck. I don't really have answers about what an individual, but one of my favorite sayings by Baldwin is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So as a sociologist, I'm in the business of just trying to speak what my best understanding of what's going on in the world, however hard and depressing it is.
On that note, I think we should probably close in prayer, if you don't mind. Because I think one of the things that's helpful about the distinction you're making is there's description, there's a descriptive work that you're helping us see, you're helping us face reality. And I don't think we should be fearful about that. We should face it. If we do have faith, right, if we do have faith in the God revealed in Jesus, we can face these realities squarely and then seek in our individual way and hopefully communally as well, institutionally, to be faithful in this present moment.
Yeah, in fact, so I'll just add to that. I'll see you and I'll raise you. I mean, it makes the most enormous difference in everything if the center of all reality and being is a loving God or not.
Right.
If up from the grave he arose is true, it changes everything, including sort of the burden that's on you to fix everything.
Right.
So, and if it's not true, then there's a biker bar down the street you may want to visit. I've heard about.
All right.
so
On that note, then, let's just have a brief word of prayer to finish up. God, we give you thanks for the space and time to face reality. And we give you thanks that you are not surprised or unaware of the challenge we're facing in this moment. As people of faith, we acknowledge that you are Lord of history, Lord of our communities, our churches, and Lord of our lives. And so we offer ourselves in this moment, as intimidating and as dark as it may feel, trusting that indeed you brought back Christ from the grave, and the resurrection of the Son of God changes everything. So we entrust ourselves to you. We look to you with hope. And so we ask for your Spirit to give us wisdom, to be faithful in our small realms of influence as individuals, to be faithful with the decisions that we have to make every day, to be faithful as communities, as institutions. But ultimately, also give us the faith to entrust the governance of the world to you. We will do our best, and at the end of the day, sit down and entrust the outcomes to you, because you are Lord of history. And we pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right.
All right, one more round of applause for Dr. Smith.